Welcome to Bedtime Boss, where every night begins with a story, and every story leads you to rest. Here, the noise of the world fades into silence, and shadows turn into whispers that guide you gently into dreams. Tonight, let the weight of the day slip away, breathe a little slower, and allow this tale to carry you safely, softly into the calm you deserve. In 1931, a secret meeting at the Franconia Hotel brought together many of the country's leading organized crime figures. Italian mobsters like Lucky Luciano sat across from Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky, and together they formed what would become known as the National Crime Syndicate. But this wasn't just about dividing territories or settling disputes. Tonight, you'll discover how a young man from the tenements of the Lower East Side helped architect the most sophisticated criminal organization America had ever seen. His story combines sharp financial skill with controversial actions that sometimes protected his community, creating a legacy that defies simple judgment. His methods would reshape organized crime and raise questions about morality that echo through history. But to understand how Meyer Lansky reached that hotel room, we must first return to his beginning as an immigrant child in a world where survival demanded difficult choices. Meyer Lansky arrived in America in 1911 as Meyer Lansky, a 9-year-old boy clutching his mother's hand as they stepped off the ship into the chaos of Ellis Island. The family settled into a cramped apartment on Eldridge Street, where multiple families crowded into buildings designed for far fewer people. Meyer's father worked 16-hour days in a sweatshop, coming home with fingers stained black from fabric dye and shoulders bent from hunching over a sewing machine. The boy watched his parents struggle to put food on the table while speaking broken English to landlords who threatened eviction. The Lower East Side in 1911 was a world where survival required constant vigilance. Pushcart vendors fought over corners, while their children dodged between horse-drawn wagons and the occasional automobile. Meyer walked to school through streets that reeked of garbage and horse manure, passing tenements where entire families lived in single rooms with no windows. He learned English faster than his parents, becoming their translator at the grocery store and the bank. But school offered little appeal for a boy who could see that education wouldn't change his family's circumstances anytime soon. The neighborhood divided along invisible lines that every kid understood. Italian boys controlled certain blocks, while Irish gangs claimed others. Jewish children, like Meyer, learned to navigate these territories carefully, knowing that the wrong turn could mean a beating, or worse. Violence was casual and frequent. Meyer watched older boys settle disputes with brass knuckles and broken bottles, understanding that reputation meant protection. But he also noticed something else. The boys who lasted longest weren't always the biggest or strongest. They were the ones who thought before they acted. Meyer's first encounter with organized crime came through watching street gangs operate near his apartment building. These weren't random street fighters. They had structure, rules, and a system for making money. The older boys collected protection money from local merchants, ran dice games in basement speakeasies, and moved stolen goods through networks that extended beyond the neighborhood. Meyer studied their methods, like other children studied their school books. He saw how they divided responsibilities, settled internal disputes, and maintained discipline within their ranks. At 13, Meyer stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than most boys 3 years younger. His size made him an easy target for bullies, but it also forced him to develop different skills. While other kids used their fists, Meyer learned to use his mind. He could calculate odds for street corner, craps games in his head, remember which merchants paid protection and which ones didn't, and spot trouble before it started. The older gang members began to notice this small, quiet boy who never seemed surprised by anything that happened on the streets. Meyer's intelligence became his currency in a world where most kids had only their physical strength to offer. He started keeping track of debts for local bookmakers, memorizing names, amounts, and payment dates. When disputes arose over who owed what to whom, Meyer became the neutral party who could recite the facts without bias. His reputation for honesty and precision grew among boys who valued these qualities, because their lives often depended on accurate information. Growing up on these streets, Meyer witnessed frequent violence that seemed pointless and wasteful. He saw men fight over small amounts of money, watched disputes escalate into bloodshed over matters that could have been resolved through simple conversation. The randomness of it struck him more than the brutality itself. Two men might end up dead over $12 when there had to be smarter ways to handle such problems. This observation would shape his thinking about how criminal enterprises could operate more efficiently. Meyer began to form ideas about how crime could work differently. Instead of random violence and territorial wars, what if criminal activity operated more like the legitimate businesses he observed? Merchants formed partnerships to share costs and risks. They negotiated with suppliers and customers rather than fighting them. They kept detailed records and planned for the future. Meyer saw no reason why illegal enterprises couldn't adopt similar approaches, making more money with less risk and fewer bodies left in the streets. His thinking crystallized around a simple observation. Most criminals were terrible businessmen. They fought over small territories when they could cooperate for larger profits. They settled every dispute with violence when negotiation might serve them better. They lived day to day instead of building something that could last. Meyer understood that the real money lay not in being the toughest guy on one block, but in organizing multiple blocks under a system that benefited everyone involved. The partnership that would change everything began when Meyer met Benjamin Siegel, a young man with a reputation for extreme violence. Where Meyer was small and calculating, Bugsy was tall and explosive. Where Meyer preferred negotiation, Bugsy reached for his gun. But they shared something crucial. Both understood that street crime as it existed was small-time thinking. Together, they began planning operations that looked beyond quick scores toward building something more substantial. Their first collaboration involved organizing protection services for pushcart vendors who were being shaken down by 3 different gangs. Instead of competing with these groups, Meyer proposed a coordination system where each gang would handle specific streets while sharing the overall profits. Bugsy provided the muscle to enforce agreements, while Meyer handled the financial arrangements. The system worked because it made more money for everyone involved, including the vendors who now paid one reasonable fee instead of multiple random demands. This early alliance established a pattern that would define Meyer's entire criminal career. He provided the strategic thinking and financial expertise while partnering with others who supplied different skills. By the time he reached his late teens, Meyer had developed a reputation as someone who could solve problems through organization rather than violence. But everything he had learned on the streets of the Lower East Side was about to be tested by an opportunity that would transform American crime forever. When Prohibition took effect in January 1920, a new and extraordinarily profitable black market opened across America. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, but it didn't ban the desire to drink. Within hours, speakeasies began opening in basement rooms and back alleys across New York City. The government had just created the largest illegal market in American history, and Meyer recognized the opportunity before most people finished reading the newspaper headlines. While legitimate businessmen scrambled to figure out what the new law meant for their operations, Meyer was already planning his response. He understood something that many politicians apparently didn't. Americans weren't going to stop drinking just because Congress told them to. The demand for alcohol would continue, but now it would be illegal, expensive, and incredibly profitable for anyone willing to supply it. Meyer saw Prohibition not as a moral crusade, but as a business opportunity that dwarfed anything he'd encountered in his years of running numbers and organizing protection rackets. The early days of bootlegging were chaotic and violent. Small gangs fought each other for control of individual speakeasies or specific neighborhoods, treating the liquor trade like an extension of traditional street crime. Irish gangs battled Italian crews while Jewish bootleggers fought among themselves, everyone trying to grab the biggest piece of territory through force alone. Bodies turned up in alleyways and floating in the East River, as different groups settled disputes with bullets rather than business sense. Meyer watched this violence with the same calculating eye he'd brought to street gambling. Seeing waste where others saw normal criminal competition, Meyer's first bootlegging operation started small but operated differently from most competitors. Instead of trying to control territory through violence, he focused on reliable supply chains and customer service. He established relationships with distillers in Canada and rum runners in the Caribbean, ensuring steady supplies of quality alcohol. When other bootleggers were selling dangerous rotgut that sometimes blinded or killed their customers, Meyer treated speakeasy owners like valued clients rather than conquered territory, offering fair prices and dependable delivery schedules that helped their businesses thrive. The financial possibilities became clear quickly. A case of whiskey that cost $12 in Canada could sell for $60 in New York speakeasies, while beer that breweries had sold for $3 a barrel now brought $15 on the black market. These weren't the small profits of numbers running or protection rackets. This was the kind of money that could transform street gangs into criminal corporations. Meyer started keeping detailed financial records, tracking expenses and profits with the same precision he'd once applied to neighborhood gambling operations. Other gangsters began to notice Meyer's methods and results. While they were losing men and money in territorial wars, his operations ran smoothly and profitably. He preferred negotiation and business solutions to establish relationships, though he maintained partnerships with men like Bugsy Siegel, who could provide muscle when needed. When disputes arose with competitors or suppliers, Meyer looked for solutions that benefited all parties rather than winner-take-all confrontations. His reputation spread through criminal circles as someone who could make deals that stuck and solve problems without creating new ones. The breakthrough insight came when Meyer realized that ethnic warfare was bad for business. Irish, Italian, and Jewish gangs were fighting each other over bootlegging territory when they could have been cooperating to maximize profits for everyone. Each group had different strengths. Italians had established smuggling networks, Jews had financial expertise, and Irish gangs controlled important political connections. Instead of competing, these groups could specialize in what they did best, while sharing the enormous profits that Prohibition made possible. Meyer's first major cross-ethnic alliance began with Frank Costello, an Italian bootlegger who shared his belief that business principles should guide criminal enterprises. They started small, with Meyer handling financial arrangements while Costello managed distribution networks. The partnership worked so well that both men began recruiting other like-minded criminals who preferred profits to violence. Soon they had Irish dockworkers unloading smuggled liquor, Jewish accountants managing the books, and Italian muscle providing protection when needed. This cooperative approach attracted attention from some of the most powerful figures in organized crime. Lucky Luciano, already emerging as a major force among Italian mobsters, recognized that Meyer's methods generated more money with fewer risks than traditional gang warfare. Arnold Rothstein, the established king of New York gambling, began using Meyer's services to handle increasingly complex financial arrangements. These relationships gave Meyer access to criminal leaders who controlled vast resources and territories. Meyer's reputation as a problem solver grew as Prohibition continued. When rival gangs threatened each other's operations, they sometimes turned to Meyer as a neutral mediator who could find solutions that avoided costly wars. When bootleggers needed reliable suppliers or secure financing, Meyer's network could provide both. When legal troubles threatened to shut down profitable operations, Meyer had developed relationships with lawyers and corrupt officials who could make problems disappear. By the mid-1920s, Meyer had become something unprecedented in American crime, a criminal consultant whose services were valued by gangsters across ethnic and territorial lines. He didn't control a specific neighborhood or run a traditional gang. Instead, he provided expertise that made other criminal enterprises more successful. His clients included Italian families, Irish stock gangs, and Jewish bootleggers who might have been fighting each other if not for Meyer's ability to show them how cooperation generated bigger profits than competition. The concept that would eventually become the national crime syndicate emerged from these practical business relationships that Meyer had been building throughout Prohibition. He envisioned a criminal organization that operated like a legitimate corporation, with different groups specializing in different activities while sharing information, resources, and profits. Violence would become a last resort rather than the first response to business disputes. Territorial boundaries would be respected to avoid wasteful conflicts. Most importantly, the enormous profits from illegal enterprises would be distributed fairly among cooperating organizations, rather than fought over endlessly. By the late 1920s, Meyer had transformed from a small-time street criminal into something entirely new, a criminal strategist whose influence extended far beyond any single operation or territory. But his growing reputation for solving problems quietly would soon make him more valuable than the flashiest gangsters of his era. The influence Meyer had built through Prohibition was about to be tested in ways that would define organized crime for generations. By 1928, he had discovered something that most criminals never understood. Fear didn't always come from the barrel of a gun. While Al Capone made headlines with spectacular violence and Lucky Luciano built his reputation through intimidation, Meyer wielded a different kind of power that proved far more lasting. He had become the man other gangsters called when they needed problems solved without gunfire. When they required financial expertise that went beyond counting cash, and when they faced situations that demanded strategic thinking rather than brute force. Meyer's mathematical precision set him apart in a world where most criminals struggled with basic arithmetic. He could calculate percentages instantly, track complex financial arrangements across multiple enterprises, and spot discrepancies that others missed completely. When bootleggers brought him their weekly receipts, Meyer would scan columns of numbers and immediately identify which speakeasies were skimming profits, which suppliers were overcharging, and which operations were generating the best returns on investment. The reputation that made Meyer truly feared began with his ability to make money disappear and reappear in ways that baffled law enforcement. He developed systems for moving criminal profits through legitimate businesses, creating paper trails that led nowhere, and financial records that told completely different stories to different audiences. A bootlegging operation's profits might flow through a chain of restaurants, laundries, and import companies before emerging as clean money that could be deposited in respectable banks. Meyer's laundering networks became so sophisticated that other crime families began paying him substantial fees just to clean their illegal earnings. Meyer's office occupied a back room behind a small restaurant on the Lower East Side, but the real business happened in his head. He memorized bank account numbers, shipping schedules, and payment dates for dozens of criminal enterprises operating across New York and beyond. When disputes arose between different gangs over money or territory, Meyer could recite exact figures and dates that resolved arguments before they escalated into violence. His word became accepted as fact in criminal circles, because other gangsters had learned that Meyer's information was always accurate, and his financial advice consistently profitable. The transformation of street crime into organized business required someone who understood both worlds, and Meyer had spent years mastering the transition. He knew which politicians could be bought and for how much, which judges would dismiss cases for the right consideration, and which police officials would look the other way when properly motivated. But Meyer's approach to corruption differed from the crude bribery that most criminals employed. He built long-term relationships with officials who benefited from ongoing cooperation rather than one-time payments, creating networks of mutual dependence that served criminal enterprises for years rather than individual transactions. Other crime bosses began seeking Meyer's counsel on matters that extended far beyond financial management. When territorial disputes threatened to explode into costly wars, they asked Meyer to mediate solutions that preserved everyone's profits. When new opportunities emerged in different cities or industries, they wanted Meyer's analysis of risks and potential returns. When law enforcement pressure increased, they relied on Meyer's political connections and strategic thinking to reduce heat without abandoning profitable operations. His influence grew not through violence or intimidation, but through consistently providing valuable services that other criminals couldn't obtain elsewhere. Meyer's strategic, business-first approach contributed to a syndicate model that would eventually use professional enforcement through organizations like Murder, Inc., which was primarily run by leaders like Louis Buchalter, while Meyer didn't personally design these enforcement operations. His systems helped reduce the random violence that had plagued organized crime for decades. Violence became a business tool, applied according to calculated decisions rather than emotional responses, creating a more systematic approach that made the entire criminal enterprise more efficient and profitable. This methodical approach to criminal organization made Meyer more influential than gangsters who killed impulsively, because other criminals understood that his systems brought professional consequences rather than random retribution. The cooperative structure he had helped develop generated enormous profits for all participating organizations, while maintaining order through calculated enforcement, rather than chaotic warfare. The historic meeting at the Franconia Hotel in 1931 represented the culmination of Meyer's decade-long effort to transform American organized crime, when the most powerful crime bosses in the country gathered to establish the National Crime Syndicate. Meyer sat at the table as an equal partner, despite controlling no traditional criminal territory. His presence reflected recognition that financial expertise and strategic planning had become as valuable as muscle and territory in the new criminal economy that Prohibition had created. The other attendees at that meeting understood what Meyer had accomplished through years of patient relationship, building and strategic thinking. Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Joe Adonis, and other major figures had all benefited from Meyer's services and recognized his contribution to their success. They weren't including him out of friendship or ethnic solidarity, but because his skills had become essential to the sophisticated criminal enterprises they were planning. Meyer's transformation from street kid to criminal strategist was complete, but his most ambitious plans were still ahead. The nickname that emerged from this period, the mob's accountant, captured only part of Meyer's significance to organized crime. He was indeed the financial genius who could make money appear and disappear as needed. But he was also the strategic architect who had helped design the cooperative structure that would govern American organized crime for decades. His influence extended into every aspect of syndicate operations, from territorial agreements to enforcement policies to long-term planning for new criminal opportunities. As the 1930s progressed and Prohibition neared its end, Meyer began looking toward new ventures that could generate the enormous profits that bootlegging had provided. His vision extended beyond the crowded streets of New York, toward opportunities in places where legal gambling might create legitimate fortunes from illegal expertise. That opportunity lay waiting in the Nevada desert, where a small town called Las Vegas was about to become the testing ground for Meyer's most ambitious vision. In 1946, Las Vegas was nothing more than a collection of dusty buildings scattered across the desert, connected by dirt roads, and featuring a few small casinos that served workers from the nearby Hoover Dam project. Most Americans had never heard of the place, and those who had thought of it as a brief stop on the way to Los Angeles rather than a destination worth visiting. Nevada's decision to legalize gambling in 1931 had attracted some attention from entrepreneurs looking for new opportunities, but most operations remained small and basic. The existing casinos featured simple slot machines and card games with limited amenities that appealed mainly to local workers and occasional travelers. Nobody had yet imagined transforming this desert outpost into a glamorous destination that could compete with established entertainment centers in New York or Chicago. Meyer recognized something in Las Vegas that others missed: the possibility of legal gambling operations that could generate enormous profits without the constant threat of law enforcement raids that plagued illegal casinos in other cities. His years of running underground gambling operations had taught him exactly how much money Americans were willing to spend on cards, dice, and slot machines when given the opportunity. Nevada's permissive gambling laws offered a chance to operate openly and legitimately while serving customers who traveled from across the country, seeking entertainment unavailable in their home states. Bugsy Siegel's vision for the Flamingo Casino captured Meyer's imagination because it combined legal gambling with luxury accommodations and world-class entertainment in a way that nobody had attempted before. Instead of crude gambling halls that attracted only desperate gamblers and local workers, the Flamingo would feature elegant restaurants, luxurious hotel rooms, swimming pools, and stage shows that could draw wealthy customers from Hollywood and beyond. The concept required massive initial investment, but promised returns that dwarfed anything possible through traditional criminal enterprises. Meyer's financial backing made Flamingo Project possible when legitimate investors showed little interest in gambling ventures located in the middle of nowhere. He provided the initial capital through his network of criminal enterprises and continued funding the project as construction costs mounted far beyond original estimates. Meyer understood that building something unprecedented required patience and substantial resources, but he also recognized that first-mover advantages in legal gambling could establish permanent competitive positions that generated profits for decades. The construction process revealed both the potential and the problems of trying to build a luxury resort in 1940s Las Vegas. What started as a project budgeted around $1 million quickly escalated to $6 million, an enormous sum that strained even Meyer's extensive financial resources. Bugsy's perfectionist tendencies drove costs higher as he demanded imported materials and elaborate decorative elements that turned the Flamingo into one of the most expensive construction projects in Nevada history. Meyer watched the escalating costs with growing concern, applying the same analytical approach to the Flamingo that he used for all his business ventures. He calculated return on investment scenarios, analyzed customer projections, and estimated how long the casino would need to operate before recovering its construction costs. The numbers became increasingly troubling as Bugsy's spending continued, without apparent regard for financial constraints or profit projections. Meyer realized that his old partner's enthusiasm for the project had overwhelmed his business judgment. The tension between friendship and financial responsibility intensified as the Flamingo's opening approached. Meyer had invested Syndicate money in the project based on Bugsy's assurances about costs and timelines, but the reality bore no resemblance to those original promises. Other crime bosses who had contributed funding began questioning Meyer's judgment and demanding explanations for the mounting expenses. Meyer found himself caught between loyalty to his childhood partner and accountability. Two criminal investors who expected profitable returns on their money. The Flamingo's opening night in December 1946 initially appeared to validate Meyer's worst fears about the project's viability. Bad weather kept many invited guests away. The casino's systems experienced technical problems, and the few customers who did attend lost less money than projected. The resort's operating expenses exceeded revenues by thousands of dollars per day, creating a financial crisis that threatened to bankrupt the entire operation within months. Meyer faced the possibility that his largest investment might become his most spectacular failure. The situation with Bugsy reached a breaking point 6 months later, when his financial mismanagement and inability to control the Flamingo's operations effectively put the entire Las Vegas investment at risk. Some chroniclers have implicated Meyer in the decision to eliminate his childhood partner, though he never admitted responsibility and remained ambiguous about his role in what followed. What remained clear was that business considerations had overwhelmed personal relationships when enormous amounts of Syndicate money were at stake. After Bugsy's death, Meyer's financial stake and influence helped guide the Flamingo's transition to new management under Syndicate associates, who understood how to control costs while maximizing revenue. The expensive management team was replaced with experienced casino operators. Unnecessary luxury services were eliminated, and the focus shifted to gambling operations that generated steady income from customers seeking entertainment, rather than elaborate amenities. The Flamingo's transformation under this new approach proved that Meyer's original vision for Las Vegas had been correct, even if the execution had been flawed. Within 2 years, the casino was generating substantial profits that vindicated Meyer's faith in legal gambling as a long-term investment strategy. More importantly, the Flamingo's success attracted other investors who began building additional casinos and hotels, creating the foundation for Las Vegas's emergence as America's gambling capital. Meyer's Las Vegas investment established patterns that would define his relationship with legal gambling for the rest of his criminal career. The success also demonstrated something else. If legal gambling could generate such enormous profits in the Nevada desert, imagine what might be possible in more exotic locations, where wealthy Americans sought entertainment and adventure unavailable anywhere in the United States. Cuba offered exactly that kind of opportunity. By the early 1950s, Lansky had gambling interests in multiple U.S. cities and strong international holdings, including major Cuban casinos. The island sat just 90 miles from Florida, close enough for wealthy Americans to visit easily, but far enough to escape United States jurisdiction. President Fulgencio Batista had created a government that welcomed foreign investment with minimal questions asked, especially when those investments came with generous payments to key officials. Havana already attracted American tourists seeking excitement unavailable at home, from elaborate floor shows to gambling games that operated without legal restrictions. Meyer saw an opportunity to create something unprecedented. Luxury casinos that combined the glamour of Las Vegas with the permissive atmosphere of a tropical paradise. Meyer's first Cuban casino opened in 1952 at the Hotel Nacion, a grand establishment overlooking Havana Bay that had hosted American celebrities and politicians since the 1930s. The casino floor featured crystal chandeliers, imported marble floors, and gaming tables staffed by dealers trained in the finest European establishments. Meyer insisted on operational standards that exceeded anything available in American casinos. From perfectly balanced dice to cards replaced after every 8 hours of play, the attention to detail created an atmosphere of luxury and fairness that attracted customers willing to gamble larger amounts than they might risk in less elegant surroundings. The financial complexity of Meyer's Cuban operations required offshore banking and shell companies to move money across international borders without attracting government attention. He used Swiss banks and created entities in Panama and the Bahamas that existed only on paper, developing networks that could convert gambling profits into untraceable assets. Modern investigators would later exploit these same financial trails to track his wealth. But at the time, these systems allowed cash from Havana casinos to flow through multiple countries before emerging as legitimate investments in American real estate. Meyer's Cuban casinos attracted a clientele that reflected America's most powerful and wealthy individuals seeking entertainment unavailable in their home country. Hollywood stars flew to Havana for weekend gambling sessions that might involve tens of thousands of dollars changing hands at single-card games. Business executives used Cuban trips as opportunities to conduct deals that required absolute privacy, knowing that Meyer's establishments operated with discretion that matched their luxury. Politicians found that Havana offered a place to relax without concern for newspaper, photographers, or political opponents who might question their recreational activities. The atmosphere of 1950s Havana under Meyer's influence combined tropical sensuality with sophisticated entertainment that rivaled anything available in New York or Paris. His casinos featured air conditioning when most American establishments still relied on fans, imported French champagne when domestic wine was the standard, and live orchestras when other venues used recorded music. The gaming floor stayed open 24 hours a day, with complimentary meals served by waiters in white jackets who spoke perfect English. High-stakes poker games might continue for days, with players sleeping in luxury suites between sessions, and returning to tables where hundreds of thousands of dollars waited to be won or lost. Meyer's relationship with Cuban government officials extended far beyond simple bribery into partnerships that benefited both sides substantially. He provided Batista's administration with reliable income streams that funded government operations while building infrastructure that attracted additional foreign investment to the island. Cuban officials received percentages of casino profits, but they also gained access to Meyer's international financial networks that could help them move their own money to safe havens outside Cuba. These relationships created mutual dependence that seemed to guarantee long-term stability for Meyer's operations. The success of Meyer's Cuban empire attracted attention from other American organized crime families who wanted to establish their own international operations. Frank Costello invested in Havana hotels, while Santo Traficante opened casinos that competed directly with Meyer's establishments. This expansion created a critical mass of American criminal investment in Cuba that made the island's gambling industry one of the largest sources of organized crime revenue outside the United States. Meyer found himself not just operating casinos, but helping coordinate an entire criminal economy that employed thousands of Cubans and generated massive profits for American crime families. Meyer expanded his Cuban holdings to include the Habana Riviera and the Montmartre Club, creating a network of luxury gambling establishments that dominated Havana's entertainment district. Each venue catered to different types of customers, from high-rolling businessmen to Hollywood celebrities seeking privacy and excitement. The combined operations generated enormous profits that federal authorities would later claim represented part of up to $300 million in hidden assets, though Meyer himself would later insist he was nearly broke by the end of his criminal career. The first signs of political instability emerged in 1956 when revolutionary groups began conducting attacks against government installations and foreign-owned businesses. Meyer initially dismissed these activities as minor threats that Batista's security forces could handle easily, but the revolutionary movement grew stronger and more organized with each passing month. The rebels specifically targeted symbols of American influence, including some of the casinos and hotels where Meyer had invested millions of dollars. What began as isolated incidents gradually escalated into a systematic second campaign against the government that protected Meyer's operations. Fidel Castro's forces entered Havana on January 1, 1959, ending Batista's government and beginning immediate seizure of foreign-owned businesses throughout Cuba. Meyer watched from his hotel room as revolutionary soldiers occupied his casinos, confiscated gaming equipment, and arrested Cuban employees suspected of collaborating with American criminals. Within 72 hours, his entire Cuban empire had been destroyed, with assets worth an estimated $20 million lost overnight. The new government made clear that American organized crime figures were no longer welcome in Cuba under any circumstances. The loss of his Cuban operations represented a devastating financial blow that forced Meyer to rebuild his criminal enterprises from scratch. But even as he dealt with this setback, events were unfolding back in New York that would test his principles in ways that money and business could never measure. These challenges would soon pale compared to a threat that struck at the heart of Meyer's identity and community. The swastika banners hanging from Madison Square Garden on February 20th, 1939, created a scene that seemed impossible in America. But 22,000 people had gathered to hear Fritz Kuhn praise Adolf Hitler and condemn Jewish Americans as enemies of the nation. The German-American Bund had transformed the famous arena into a Nazi rally, complete with stormtroopers, anti-Semitic speeches, and calls for American fascism that echoed what was happening across the Atlantic. Outside the venue, Jewish families hurried past with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with Bund members who wore armbands bearing Nazi symbols and shouted slogans that promised to make America free from Jewish influence. Meyer Lansky read newspaper accounts of the rally from his office on the Lower East Side, studying photographs that showed thousands of Americans giving Nazi salutes, while speakers denounced everything his community represented. The Bund wasn't just holding meetings. They were organizing camps across the country, where children learned to march in formation, adults practiced military drills, and families celebrated Hitler's birthday as a holiday. Their publications called for boycotts of Jewish businesses, deportation of Jewish immigrants, and laws that would strip Jewish Americans of their citizenship rights. Law enforcement's response to these activities ranged from indifferent to supportive, with many police departments treating Bund rallies as legitimate political gatherings protected by the First Amendment. When Jewish community groups filed complaints about hate speech or threats of violence, officers often responded that no actual crimes had been committed and that free speech rights protected even offensive political opinions. Some police departments included officers who attended Bund meetings as sympathizers, creating situations where victims of anti-Semitic harassment found little help from authorities who were supposed to protect them. The turning point came when Judge Nathan Perlman approached Meyer with an unusual request. The respected jurists understood that legal remedies wouldn't protect Jewish neighborhoods from escalating harassment and violence, and he knew that Meyer's criminal networks could solve problems through direct action when official channels proved ineffective. Perlman asked Meyer to organize defensive operations against the Bund, with one crucial stipulation: no killings. Meyer accepted the assignment, understanding that this fight served purposes beyond any criminal enterprise he had ever undertaken. The recruitment process drew from Meyer's extensive criminal network while also attracting Jewish men who had no connection to organized crime but wanted to fight fascism through direct action. Boxers from local gyms volunteered their services for free, understanding that their fighting skills could serve a righteous purpose. Dock workers contributed muscle and organizational experience from their labor disputes. Veterans of World War I brought military training that proved valuable for planning coordinated attacks on Bund meetings and facilities. Meyer also coordinated with other Jewish gangsters like Abner Zwillman and Mickey Cohen, creating a network that extended beyond New York into other cities where Nazi sympathizers were organizing. Meyer's anti-fascist operations began with intelligence gathering that rivaled anything law enforcement agencies were conducting. His men attended Bund meetings to collect information about membership, planned activities, and security arrangements. They photographed license plates at rallies, followed known members to identify their homes and workplaces, and monitored Bund publications for advance notice of upcoming events. This intelligence network allowed Meyer's forces to plan disruptions with precision, while avoiding unnecessary confrontations with police or innocent bystanders. The first major confrontation occurred at a Bund meeting in Newark, where men entered the hall during a speech and began overturning tables, destroying Nazi literature, and confronting anyone who tried to stop them. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes, but sent the message that Nazi activities would face organized resistance. Police arrested several of Meyer's men, but witnesses proved reluctant to cooperate with investigations, and most charges were quietly dropped after pressure from Jewish community leaders who had political connections. Meyer's campaign against the Bund escalated as Nazi activities increased throughout 1938 and 1939. His men vandalized Bund offices, destroying printing equipment used to produce anti-Semitic literature. They followed prominent Bund members and delivered clear messages about the consequences of continued Nazi activities. When Bund camps tried to hold summer gatherings, Meyer's forces would arrive to disrupt facilities and intimidate participants into leaving early. The coordination between Meyer's criminal network and established Jewish community organizations created an unusual alliance that served both groups' interests. Rabbis and community leaders provided information about planned Bund activities while maintaining distance from any violence that followed. Jewish business owners contributed financial support from Meyer's operations while publicly condemning both fascism and criminal methods. This arrangement allowed respectable community members to fight anti-Semitism through proxies while preserving their legitimate reputations. Some law enforcement officers began quietly cooperating with Meyer's anti-fascist activities, recognizing that his methods were accomplishing what legal approaches couldn't achieve. Police would sometimes delay their response to reports of attacks on Bund meetings, giving Meyer's men time to complete their work before arrests became necessary. Prosecutors occasionally found that key witnesses were unavailable when cases involving anti-fascist violence reached court, resulting in dismissed charges that frustrated Bund members seeking justice through official channels. The effectiveness of Meyer's campaign became apparent as Bund membership declined and their public activities grew more cautious throughout. 1939. Rally attendance dropped significantly when potential participants realized they might face organized resistance for supporting Nazi ideology. Bund publications reduced their anti-Semitic content after repeated attacks on their facilities made production expensive and dangerous. Several prominent Bund leaders relocated to other cities or quietly abandoned their political activities after receiving personal visits from Meyer's representatives. These interventions proved effective at protecting Jewish communities, but raised troubling questions about bypassing legal channels through organized violence. Meyer's anti-Nazi activities created complex relationships within Jewish communities that struggled to reconcile their appreciation for his protective efforts with their moral objections to his criminal methods. The success of his campaign against fascism would soon force respectable community leaders to confront uncomfortable truths about their relationship with the very criminals they publicly condemned. The morning after Meyer's men disrupted another Bund rally in Queens, community leaders faced congregations divided by emotions they couldn't easily express. Some members whispered their gratitude that someone was finally fighting back against the Nazi sympathizers who had been harassing Jewish shopkeepers and intimidating children walking to school. Others worried that associating their community with criminal violence would confirm the worst stereotypes that anti-Semites use to justify their hatred. Rabbis stood at their pulpits, knowing that whatever they said about Meyer Lansky would satisfy some congregants, while disappointing others, who held equally sincere convictions about right and wrong. The complexity of Meyer's relationship with respectable Jewish society emerged most clearly during community events where his presence created uncomfortable situations for everyone involved. Lansky and other gangsters made donations and offered protective help to Jewish institutions. Much of it was quietly accepted or anonymous. Meyer would contribute substantial amounts that organizations desperately needed but couldn't publicly acknowledge. He never sought recognition for his charitable activities, never requested special treatment at community events, and never used his donations to demand influence over organizational decisions. His approach reflected a careful calculation that pushing for acceptance would damage the very institutions he wanted to support. Meyer understood that his criminal reputation made him a liability for legitimate community leaders who needed to maintain their standing with government officials and business partners. He contributed money and protection while asking for nothing more than the right to remain connected to the community that had shaped his identity. This arrangement allowed him to support Jewish causes, while community leaders maintained the distance they needed to preserve their legitimate reputations. The internal debates within Jewish organizations about Meyer's role revealed deeper questions about moral authority and community loyalty that had no clear answers. Board members privately acknowledged that criminal violence had accomplished more against the bunt in 6 months than their legal strategies had achieved in 3 years. Social workers who counseled families terrorized by anti-Semitic harassment knew that Meyer's reputation for violent retaliation had reduced attacks in their neighborhoods. Yet these same professionals understood that publicly supporting criminal methods would undermine their credibility and potentially encourage vigilante violence that might target innocent people. Meyer's charitable activities extended beyond simple financial contributions to include personal interventions that saved lives, while creating new moral complications for community leaders. When Jewish families faced eviction from apartments owned by anti-Semitic landlords, Meyer would sometimes arrange for the property owners to experience problems that encouraged more reasonable behavior. When Jewish businesses received threats from Nazi sympathizers, Meyer's men would visit the threatening parties to explain why continued harassment might prove dangerous for their health. These interventions protected vulnerable community members but also implicated them in criminal activities that many found morally troubling. Lansky's family navigated the awkward distance that his reputation created in their daily social interactions. His wife struggled with invitations to community events where other women would be polite but distant, never quite accepting her into their social circles while never completely excluding her either. Meyer's children attended Hebrew school alongside the sons and daughters of respected professionals who taught them Jewish values that seemed to contradict their father's criminal career. These tensions created constant reminders that Meyer's dual role as protector and predator placed his family in situations where they belonged nowhere completely. Community rabbis found themselves wrestling with theological questions about justice and righteousness that their religious training hadn't prepared them to answer clearly. Traditional Jewish law emphasized the obligation to protect innocent life and defend community members from persecution, but it also condemned violence and criminal behavior as violations of divine commandments. Some rabbis concluded that extraordinary circumstances like the Nazi threat justified extraordinary responses that might otherwise be forbidden. Others maintained that criminal methods corrupted righteous goals and that communities should rely on legal remedies even when they proved ineffective. The practical benefits of Meyer's protection created dependencies that complicated efforts to maintain moral distance from his criminal activities. Jewish shopkeepers noticed that anti-Semitic vandalism decreased significantly in neighborhoods where Meyer's men were known to operate, but they also understood that this protection came with implicit expectations about loyalty and silence. Community organizations received substantial anonymous donations that clearly originated from criminal enterprises, but rejecting the money would have meant canceling programs that served needy families and vulnerable immigrants. Young Jewish men faced particular confusion about Meyer's example, seeing someone who had achieved wealth and power while maintaining connections to their shared community and values. Some viewed him as a role model who had succeeded despite facing the same discrimination and poverty they experienced daily. Others recognized that his criminal methods offered short-term solutions to immediate problems while creating long-term dangers that could destroy the very community he claimed to protect. These conflicting interpretations reflected broader disagreements about assimilation, success, an identity that affected Jewish Americans throughout the 20th century. Meyer's relationship with mainstream Jewish organizations remained complicated by the recognition that his anti-fascist activities had probably saved lives and prevented worse violence against Jewish communities during the 1930s. Historical evidence suggested that organized criminal opposition to the Bund had been more effective than legal challenges or peaceful protests in reducing Nazi recruitment and intimidating potential sympathizers. Yet this effectiveness came with moral costs that many community leaders found impossible to accept, creating lasting tensions between pragmatic gratitude and ethical principles. The moral ambiguity surrounding Meyer's dual role as criminal and community protector reflected broader questions about how societies should respond to threats that legal institutions cannot adequately address. But by the 1960s, these philosophical debates would become academic concerns as federal law enforcement developed new tools that threatened to end Meyer's criminal career entirely. The same government that had failed to protect Jewish communities from Nazi harassment was now turning its full attention toward the man who had filled that void through criminal methods. Federal investigators had spent years developing new tools that could penetrate the careful security measures Meyer had relied on for decades. By the early 1960s, electronic surveillance capabilities allowed agents to intercept conversations that would have been impossible to monitor just 10 years earlier. Wiretaps now captured phone calls between crime bosses, hidden microphones recorded private meetings, and financial investigators could trace money through banking systems with unprecedented precision. The same technological advances that were transforming American society were also revolutionizing criminal investigations in ways that threatened everyone involved in organized crime. Meyer's morning routine at the Fontainebleau Hotel remained unchanged, but he now understood that privacy had become an illusion. He conducted important conversations while walking on the beach, knowing that ocean sounds would interfere with electronic surveillance equipment. He avoided using telephones for anything beyond casual social calls, communicating through trusted intermediaries who could deliver messages without creating recorded evidence. His suite featured a radio that played constantly, generating background noise that might mask sensitive discussions from listening devices that investigators could have planted anywhere. The investigation that would eventually destroy Meyer's freedom began with a simple tax case that escalated as federal agents discovered the scope of his financial operations. Internal Revenue Service auditors initially focused on discrepancies between Meyer's reported income and his obvious wealth, but their inquiry revealed banking records that connected him to criminal enterprises across multiple states and countries. Each financial thread they followed led to new evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, and unreported income that spanned decades of criminal activity. Federal prosecutors assembled their case using methods that Meyer's generation of criminals hadn't anticipated when they built their organizations in the 1920s and 1930s. Computer systems could now analyze thousands of financial transactions to identify patterns that human investigators would have missed. International banking cooperation allowed American authorities to access Swiss accounts and offshore companies that had once provided perfect secrecy. Most dangerously, prosecutors had developed sophisticated plea bargaining strategies that encouraged former associates to provide testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. Frank Costello's legal troubles around 1961 demonstrated the danger that modern investigative techniques posed to organized crime figures. Costello had maintained legitimate business fronts and avoided direct involvement in violent crimes for years. But prosecutors built a successful case using wiretap evidence and financial records that proved his connection to organized crime activities. His conviction showed other crime bosses that traditional methods of avoiding prosecution were no longer effective against determined federal investigators. Meyer's paranoia intensified as longtime associates began disappearing from their usual haunts, either because they had been arrested or because they feared imminent prosecution. Men who had worked with him for 30 years stopped returning phone calls, avoided their regular restaurants, and canceled meetings without explanation. The criminal network that had once provided Meyer with protection and information began fragmenting as individual members looked for ways to save themselves from federal prosecution. Trust, which had been the foundation of organized crime cooperation, evaporated when faced with the possibility of lengthy prison sentences. The international scope of Meyer's operations, which had once provided protection from American law enforcement, now created additional vulnerabilities that prosecutors could exploit. His Cuban casino investments had generated documentation that proved unreported income, while his Swiss banking arrangements violated currency reporting requirements that carried serious criminal penalties. Money laundering operations that had moved profits through multiple countries left paper trails that federal investigators could follow, despite their complexity. What had seemed like sophisticated criminal planning now appeared to be evidence of systematic law-breaking that prosecutors could present to juries. Meyer's advancing age transformed the prospect of criminal prosecution from an occupational hazard into something far more serious. At 60 years old, he suffered from heart problems that made physical stress dangerous, and his doctors warned that prison conditions could prove harmful for someone with his medical conditions. A lengthy federal sentence would likely mean spending his remaining years behind bars, making the stakes of his legal troubles far higher than they would have been 20 years earlier. The combination of serious charges and personal vulnerability created pressure that Meyer had never experienced during his earlier brushes with law enforcement. The decision to flee the United States represented a complete reversal of Meyer's lifelong strategy of fighting legal challenges through political connections and skilled attorneys. His lawyers warned that federal prosecutors had assembled enough evidence to secure convictions on multiple charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. Appeals would likely fail because the government's case relied on documented financial transactions rather than witness testimony that might be discredited. For the first time in his criminal career, Meyer faced legal problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation, corruption, or intimidation. Meyer's preparations for leaving America required dismantling financial networks and criminal relationships that had taken decades to build. He liquidated investments, closed bank accounts, and severed business partnerships that had generated millions of dollars in annual profits. Associates who had depended on his coordination and expertise suddenly found themselves without the strategic leadership that had made their own operations successful. The empire that Meyer had spent his adult life constructing began collapsing as soon as he stepped away from active management. The flight from Miami International Airport in 1970 marked the end of Meyer's direct involvement in American organized crime after nearly 50 years of criminal leadership. His departure created a power vacuum within organized crime that would never be filled by anyone with his combination of financial expertise and strategic vision. The era of criminal cooperation that Meyer had helped create was ending, along with his freedom to operate in the country where he had built his reputation and fortune. But Meyer's destination offered what seemed like the perfect solution to his legal troubles. A homeland that promised sanctuary to any Jewish person seeking refuge from persecution. Israel offered no such refuge when Meyer arrived at Tel Aviv's Lod Airport in 1970, carrying a small suitcase and decades of accumulated fear about what awaited him back in America. The 68-year-old man who had once controlled gambling empires across 3 countries now depended on a single legal provision for his freedom: Israel's law of return, which guaranteed citizenship to any Jewish person seeking refuge in the homeland. Meyer believed his Jewish birth and lifelong connection to Jewish communities would provide sanctuary that American extradition treaties couldn't penetrate. The irony wasn't lost on him that Independence Day in the country he was fleeing had become his first day seeking protection in the country he hoped would accept him, Disraeli. Immigration officials at the airport faced an unprecedented situation when Meyer presented his passport and requested immediate citizenship under the law of return. The law had been designed to welcome Holocaust survivors and Jewish refugees fleeing persecution, not international criminals escaping prosecution in democratic countries. Immigration officers recognized Meyer's name from intelligence briefings that had warned of his possible arrival, but they also understood that rejecting a Jewish applicant without proper legal procedures could create dangerous precedents for future refugee cases. They granted him temporary visitor status, while bureaucrats in Jerusalem debated how to handle the most famous Jewish gangster in history. American officials raised objections and provided documentation of Meyer's criminal activities and outstanding legal charges, emphasizing that his prosecution involved tax evasion and financial crimes rather than political persecution that might justify refugee status. The diplomatic pressure created an immediate crisis for Israeli officials who valued their relationship with America while trying to maintain their commitment to Jewish immigration. State Department representatives argued that harboring international criminals would damage American-Israeli relations and undermine global cooperation against organized crime. Meyer rented a small apartment in Herzliya, a coastal town north of Tel Aviv, and began the waiting process that would define his final years of freedom. He maintained a quiet lifestyle that attracted minimal attention, reading Hebrew newspapers in cafes and taking daily walks along the Mediterranean beaches that reminded him of his Miami hotels. Local residents gradually learned about his identity, but treated him with curious respect rather than fear or hostility. Some saw him as a celebrity whose criminal reputation added excitement to their peaceful community, while others viewed him as a fellow Jew seeking refuge in troubled times. The legal battle surrounding Meyer's citizenship application revealed fundamental questions about Jewish identity and moral behavior that Israeli society had never confronted directly. His lawyers argued that the law of return made no exceptions based on criminal behavior, that Meyer's Jewish ancestry and cultural connections qualified him for citizenship, regardless of his activities in other countries. They emphasized his charitable contributions to Jewish causes and his violent opposition to Nazi groups during the 1930s as evidence of his commitment to Jewish welfare. Religious authorities found themselves divided over whether criminal behavior could disqualify someone from claiming their birthright as a member of the Jewish people. Opposition to Meyer's citizenship came from Israeli officials who worried about their country becoming a haven for international criminals seeking to escape justice through claims of ethnic solidarity. They argued that accepting Meyer would encourage other wanted criminals to seek Israeli citizenship, potentially damaging the country's international reputation and complicating diplomatic relationships with allies who had their own organized crime problems. Police officials expressed concern that Meyer's presence might attract other American mobsters and create security risks that Israel's limited law enforcement resources couldn't handle effectively. The political debate extended beyond legal technicalities into broader questions about Israel's national character and moral standards. Some politicians argued that a Jewish state should welcome all Jews, regardless of their past mistakes, emphasizing forgiveness and redemption as fundamental Jewish values. Others maintained that Israel had a responsibility to uphold international law and support legitimate criminal prosecutions, even when they involved Jewish defendants. The controversy created unusual political alliances, with some religious conservatives supporting Meyer's application, while secular liberals opposed it based on concerns about rule of law. Meyer's daily routine during his time in Israel reflected the uncertainty of his legal situation and the isolation that came from living in permanent limbo. He learned basic Hebrew and attended synagogue services occasionally, trying to demonstrate his commitment to Jewish life while his case moved through the courts. His apartment remained sparsely furnished because he couldn't be sure whether he would be allowed to stay or forced to leave at any moment. Former criminal associates avoided contact with him recognizing that their communications might be monitored by both Israeli and American intelligence services. The Israeli Supreme Court's decision in 1972 balanced competing legal principles, while recognizing the political realities that surrounded Meyer's case. The justices acknowledged that the law of return didn't explicitly exclude criminals, but they ruled that someone fleeing prosecution for serious crimes couldn't claim refugee status in Israel. They determined that Meyer's situation differed fundamentally from Jewish refugees fleeing persecution because his legal troubles resulted from his own criminal choices rather than ethnic discrimination. The decision established important precedents about the limits of Israeli sanctuary while maintaining the country's commitment to accepting legitimate Jewish immigrants. Both legal and diplomatic concerns guided the Israeli refusal, as officials sought to maintain their immigration principles while preserving crucial international relationships. American officials celebrated the court's decision as vindication of international legal cooperation and evidence that ethnic solidarity couldn't override criminal justice. Israeli officials privately expressed relief that they had avoided a diplomatic crisis while maintaining legal principles that would guide future immigration decisions. Meyer's lawyers exhausted their appeals within months, leaving him with no choice but to accept deportation or face arrest as an illegal immigrant in the country he had hoped would become his final refuge. Meyer's departure from Israel in 1972 marked the end of his last attempt to avoid facing American justice through geographical escape. The man who had spent decades building international networks and global influence now faced the reality that there was nowhere left to run. His return to America would force a final reckoning with the choices that had defined his extraordinary and contradictory life. Meyer Lansky died on January 15, 1983, in a modest Miami Beach apartment that bore no resemblance to the luxury hotels and casinos where he had once wielded enormous power. The man who federal authorities had claimed controlled gambling empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars left behind an estate with estimates putting his bank account in the low tens of thousands, well below earlier federal estimates of hidden wealth. His funeral drew a small crowd of elderly relatives and a few neighborhood acquaintances who remembered him as a quiet man who fed stray cats and complained about his arthritis. No current crime bosses attended the service, and newspaper obituaries focused more on his legal troubles than his criminal achievements. The organizational structures that Meyer had helped create outlived their architect by decades, continuing to generate profits for criminal enterprises that operated according to principles he had established 50 years earlier. The cooperative approach to organized crime that emerged from his 1930s negotiations between ethnic gangs became the standard model for American criminal organizations throughout the 20th century. Crime families continued to respect territorial agreements, share information about law enforcement activities, and coordinate their operations to avoid wasteful conflicts that reduced profits for everyone involved. Meyer's vision of crime as business had become so deeply embedded in organized crime culture that most participants never questioned its origins. Methods Lansky helped popularize, including cooperation across ethnic groups and the use of offshore banks, became templates that others adapted for both criminal and legitimate purposes. His techniques for laundering criminal profits through shell companies and offshore banks provided frameworks that both criminals and legitimate businesses later used to move money across international borders. Swiss banking secrecy laws, Caribbean tax havens, and complex corporate structures that Meyer had exploited during his criminal career eventually became standard tools for wealthy individuals and multinational corporations seeking to minimize their tax obligations through legal means. Las Vegas stood as Meyer's most visible legacy, a city that had grown from his initial investments in the Flamingo Casino into the gambling capital of the world. The sophisticated casino operations, luxury hotel amenities, and professional entertainment that Meyer had insisted upon became the industry standard that attracted millions of visitors annually. His understanding that legal gambling could generate more profits than illegal operations had proved correct beyond his wildest projections, creating an industry worth billions of dollars that employed hundreds of thousands of people in Nevada and other states that legalized casino gambling. The moral complexity of Meyer's anti-fascist activities continued to generate debate among historians, who struggled to balance his criminal career against his violent opposition to Nazi sympathizers during the 1930s. Some scholars argued that his willingness to use criminal methods against political extremists represented a form of community self-defense that legal institutions had failed to provide. Others maintained that vigilante violence, regardless of its targets or motivations, undermined democratic principles and rule of law that were essential for protecting minority communities in the long term. Jewish communities maintained complicated relationships with Meyer's memory, acknowledging his charitable contributions and protective efforts, while rejecting his criminal methods and violent solutions to community problems. Some synagogues quietly accepted donations from funds that might have originated from his criminal enterprises, while others established policies that explicitly excluded money from questionable sources. Community leaders continued to wrestle with questions about whether accepting help from criminals compromised their moral authority and whether desperate circumstances justified cooperation with people whose other activities they condemned. The transformation of organized crime that Meyer had orchestrated represented both his greatest achievement and his most troubling legacy. His success in reducing random violence and establishing cooperative relationships between criminal organizations had probably saved hundreds of lives by eliminating wasteful gang wars and territorial disputes. Yet these same innovations had also made organized crime more efficient, profitable, and difficult for law enforcement to combat. The sophisticated criminal enterprises that emerged from Meyer's strategic planning could generate enormous profits while maintaining lower profiles that allowed them to operate with less government interference. Meyer's international criminal networks had established patterns of cooperation between American organized crime and foreign criminal organizations that persisted long after his death. His relationships with corrupt officials in Cuba, Switzerland, and other countries created templates for future criminal enterprises seeking to operate across national borders. The money laundering techniques he had developed continued to evolve, with new technologies allowing modern criminal organizations to move profits through global financial systems with speed and secrecy that would have amazed even Meyer's sophisticated operation. The question of how history should happen. Remember, Meyer Lansky remained unsettled decades after his death, with different communities and institutions reaching different conclusions about his significance and moral character. Law enforcement agencies remembered him as a criminal mastermind whose innovations had made their jobs more difficult and whose influence had corrupted legitimate institutions. Jewish communities struggled with his dual identity as protector and predator, recognizing both his contributions to their safety and his damage to their reputation. Academic historians found his life useful for exploring broader themes about immigration, assimilation, and the pursuit of American success through both legitimate and criminal means. The contradictions that defined Meyer's life reflected broader tensions within American society about success, morality, and the prices that individuals and communities pay for prosperity and security. His story illustrated how historical circumstances could create situations where traditional moral categories proved inadequate for understanding human behavior. The immigrant child who had learned survival skills on the Lower East Side had applied those lessons to build criminal enterprises that generated enormous wealth, while also protecting vulnerable communities from political persecution. These unresolved questions about Meyer Lansky's legacy reveal something fundamental about how we understand the past and the people who shaped it. The man who emerged from those circumstances defied simple categorization. Meyer Lansky's transformation from immigrant child to syndicate architect 2. Community. Protector illustrates how individuals can embody seemingly contradictory values throughout their lives. The 9-year-old boy who arrived at Ellis Island became a criminal mastermind who also fought fascists in American streets. Using methods that saved lives while breaking laws, did his protection of Jewish communities redeem his crimes? History offers no simple answer. The choices we make in difficult times reveal not just who we are, but who we might become when faced with impossible decisions. If you enjoyed this exploration of moral complexity, please subscribe for more stories that examine the nuanced truths behind history's most fascinating figures.